The Phantasma is a launcher, shotgun, beam weapon hybrid thing with a whole lot of status chance and two really interesting firing modes. The primary fire is a shotgun of multiple beams. You can kind of see them wiggling around in there. And if I add on Vicious Spread, you can see them fan out into this nice horizontal clustery shape. And the secondary fire charges up by consuming ammo from your magazine and then launches a plasma cluster bomb when you let go or when your magazine runs out. That explodes into homing missiles, and you get more homing missiles the more ammo you feed your bomb before firing, again, up to your whole magazine. So that's how it works, and as you saw before, this is what it does to enemies, but we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Behold, my Phantasma build. We'll go from least to most complex mod choices. I'm still running multi-shot, even though beam weapons don't produce extra status procs each second if hitting an enemy with multiple beams. Multi-shot is still a separate damage multiplier for both firing modes and adds a lot of output to the bombs no matter what, but it also has some further value to the beams with Vicious Spread. We'll get back to that. Ammo stock is very important as a sustained damage mod. Even with the Phantasma's very fast reload speed of half a second, and given that beam firing consumes ammo at half the expected speed, you're still spending over 20% of your time using the beam mode just reloading it, and you'll always be interrupted by a reload if the beams don't kill an enemy within about 2 seconds. Ammo stock allows you to spend even longer than 60% more time firing before reload, because it happens to bring the magazine of 11 up to 17 points, which rounds up and gives you another free round. Ammo stock also potentially allows you to make larger charged bombs with the secondary fire for peeking at big groups of enemies or just preparing damage while approaching a fight. Got a lot of that basic stuff out of the way really quick, but now I'm going to talk about the status chance. Disclaimer up front, I am not positive that this is what's happening, but given what I've been seeing while testing different builds out, I think this is the interaction. Since the Phantasma does have what amounts to innate multi-shot with its shotgun of multiple beams, its status chance is divided among those beams, just as pellet-based weapons have their status chance divided among their pellets. You still get a ton of status effects, because the fire rate is very high, the status chance is similarly high at 37% at base, and a lot of people are running 2 dual status elements on this thing innately, so that's still a lot of status. You still see a lot of status. But on weapons with divided status chance, reaching 100% status before additional multi-shot mods are applied causes all the pellets, or in this case beams, to produce a status effect every single time they deal damage. And that does appear to happen if you bump the Phantasma up with a third dual status element, as you can see. But it's not immediately apparent, and I think I know why. Because beam weapons don't produce multiple status effects when beams overlap on a target. The difference isn't very noticeable when firing the beam without Vicious Spread at a single enemy, because many of the beams are hitting the target at once, so it's going to look like consistent status, and it's not going to seem divided because it's like you're firing one beam, but it should be proccing, dozens of statuses every second, and it definitely isn't doing that. It's much more noticeable when you use the beam in the fan configuration caused by Vicious Spread. Let's go show that. So you can see that with Vicious Spread and targets staggered like this, if I fire, many of the beams spread out hit individual targets and do appear to be producing 12 status effects each second. Now if I remove that third dual status element, remember it's not about damage, it's just about how much status we're getting, you can see dramatically less statuses. You see there are a lot more than just, it says we have 80% chance to proc status, but you can see a lot more than just 20% of those packets of damage are not proccing status effects, which would indicate that the status is being divided among the beams before 100% status, before additional multi-shot. Oh, there are so many qualifiers every time you explain this. Although, because of the way that beam weapons work, you can see that the status output doesn't go up or down with multi-shot, which it does on most weapons, so it's easier to see that this weapon has the amount of status it actually has. Multi-shot just increases chances to get status output. It doesn't actually increase status chance, which seems very similar. So we're going to put back on the third dual status element, and for comparison's sake, you can see, again, definitely a lot more than just 20% more status output. It says that we have only 20% more status than before, but this is way more status than that, which would indicate that the mechanic of status being divided below 100% status chance before additional multi-shot does appear to be present on the beam mode of this weapon. Again, I think the intricacies of beam mechanics make that less clear without Vicious Spread on, but when you isolate the beams, I think it's pretty clear. The plasma cluster bombs from the secondary fire also divide their status chance. In this case, it's among their little missiles. You're going to see that every single missile procs a status effect each, and then we're going to take off the third dual status element. Again, not about damage, just to demonstrate the chain change in status, and then we're going to fire that same cluster bomb again with the entire magazine, and you're going to see that more than 20% of the little homing missile things don't proc a status. So they're going to fly in. You see quite a few of those didn't proc a status. Not 20%, it was like a good half or more of them missed their status effects, which isn't consistent with the amount of status we saw in the arsenal. Again, eyeballing it, that was a lot more than 20% packets of damage that did not proc a status each. And then if we push the status chance back to 100%, you can see very clearly that every single little pellet is procking status, as expected. So this weapon is a little bit different with the 100% status before multi-shot thing, like with that mattering. Most of the weapons, it's that they proc basically no status, and then if you get them there, they proc a ton. This weapon does proc a lot of status either way, and it's much more about the net increase in status output being so high, regardless of the fact that you do deal good amounts of status without 100% before multi-shot. So again, it seems like both firing modes do use divided status chance calculations, so it is very important to push this weapon to 100% status chance before additional multi-shot. It produces deceptively low, not actually low, but relatively low status output until it reaches that point due to those divided status calculations, and then once it gets there, it shows a non-linear increase in power given the third dual status element. You wouldn't expect to have such a large jump in power, and yet it does because of those divided calculations. Just to drive this home, on weapons that don't divide their status among innate multi-shot, stacking up a lot of status is usually very inefficient and suboptimal unless you have no other option, since you get smaller and smaller marginal gains in status output with each additional dual status element. If this weapon didn't have divided status calculations, then taking off this one mod would really only lose you 20% status output, which is not a big deal. This is still a lot of status, and it would generally be better to put something else here. I would probably run Contagious Spread and give myself more corrosive procs, but because this weapon does divide its status output with innate multi-shot, it will get a huge spike in output upon reaching specifically that 100% status before additional multi-shot threshold, which usually makes that the strongest build for weapons that can do this. The only exceptions are usually weapons that have some very good other things to be doing. One of my favorite examples of a weapon that could reach 100% status before additional multi-shot, but doesn't necessarily automatically want to, like its strongest build is not inherently doing that, is the Vacor Heck. And that's because this weapon can have good crits and does have access to hunter munitions, meaning that because it has pellets and crits, it gets really consistent slash procs, lots of them, and it does very good damage without reaching that status threshold. In addition, reaching that status threshold would crowd out its crit mods, and it has other damage multipliers it could be playing around with, so you are actually losing something by not running those. And that makes it a weapon where its optimal build is not necessarily to reach 100% status before multi-shot, even though it can. But there are very few examples. Most of the time, the strongest build for a weapon that can get there is to get there. And that's definitely the case here. I do think Vicious Spread is pretty powerful as well, since it seems to boost overall status output by keeping the beams away from each other. Of course, it does lower your single target damage. You're not going to kill individual targets as quickly. Even though you aren't really losing status due to that beam mechanic thing, you are losing, well, the damage those beams would deal. All those beams on the side are not hitting that enemy in the center, although it does take overall higher damage. You're seeing the enemies on the fringes don't die quite as quickly. But this still kills things pretty fast, and it has so much status output if you spread out the beams that I feel like it's pretty much worth it. And then, of course, the secondary fire doesn't really appreciably miss with Vicious Spread because it's made of homing missiles. So overall, I'd say this weapon is pretty well suited to the horde shooter we find ourselves in. It does incredible AoE damage, and even if you're just using the beam, it seems to pierce through enemies in its area. The area that the beams affect, it just hits everything in that area, and you can see that it's really, really good against crowds. If you have a lot of enemies in front of you, it's very, very powerful. And those little homing bomblets, those little missiles, those actually do produce an AoE explosion. So you can see that in very tight groups, they have devastating effects because they actually aren't hitting single enemies, and they produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of statuses each second. Well, that's it for the Phantasma. I've been Zandy, and I hope you've enjoyed this look at a very strange hybrid of beam mechanics and shotgun mechanics and a launcher with homing missiles. A really fantastic and fun weapon, and something that's very difficult to analyze, but I hope that I made sense. If you have any further questions, hit me up in the comments. Check me out on Patreon if you want more of this content or you just want to support me making it, and I'll see y'all next time.